your YouTube video on that last section that I needed to finish on monopsony. I am going to Angels here because he wants a head start on monopsony markets or understanding how monopsonies or introducing this idea of a monopsony can affect our thinking about minimum wage regulation and all that good stuff. So let's get started. So he may ask questions as we go along too. Okay, so before when we did sort of a, let me get my glove. I have a glove for my little magic notepad. I haven't used this magic notepad in a while, so I forgot that I got a glove, or I should have a glove. What? I don't have a glove. Oh well. I'll continue. Here's one. Just makes writing so much easier on this notepad. Okay. So let's think about the kind of minimum wage, I guess not model, but in Unit 2, when we were introducing this idea of consumer and producer surplus and social surplus and government interventions and how they affect consumer and producer surplus, we thought about the minimum wage. Let me erase this. Let me just start over. Implicitly, we were assuming a perfectly competitive input market, meaning a situation in which we expect the producers, meaning the workers in a perfectly competitive labor market, to be able to shop costlessly across firms to search for the highest wage. And there'd be perfect information about wages and all that sorts of stuff. And so that's an unrealistic market assumption, and that has significant impact, I guess, on minimum wage analysis. So let's look at the low-skilled labor market, and let's make this assumption of a perfectly competitive input market where workers are able to shop costlessly across firms. Some of you that are working now kind of know that this is a very significant market assumption because some of you work at either Chick-fil-A or other different types of fast food joints, and you don't know who in the area is charging what. And maybe you've developed like a lot of social ties to the workers at whatever restaurant you're working. And so therefore, we'll see that this translates into market power for that firm and is reflective of an imperfectly competitive input market. So perfect competition input market, perfectly competitive input market is the assumption we're making. And this y-axis is going to represent the wage, and the x-axis is going to represent the quantity of labor. Okay. And so this W1 is going to be the equilibrium wage in this market, and this is going to represent the equilibrium quantity in this market of laborers. Let's just say there's 60. So if we set a minimum wage for whatever this market is, we can think of it as a binding price floor or a price floor. It doesn't necessarily have to be binding, but for it to be binding, it has to be above the equilibrium wage. So this is a binding price floor. It's a binding minimum wage. And in our analysis before, we said, okay, we're going to see that this creates a gap because it's a higher wage, so there's going to be more workers that are going to, because of the substitution effect, enter the labor market. And so maybe there will be 70 workers that are suddenly going to want to work. But of course, because now we're at this higher point along the demand curve, we can see that the quantity demanded for those workers actually falls. So this gap right here is what we called new unemployment. And then we said that this is going to represent deadweight loss. Those are market transactions that would have taken place if the government intervention didn't happen. But because the government intervention happened, they never actually happened. And then we can actually represent consumer surplus. The new consumer surplus is everything below the wage rate and above, I'm sorry, the producer surplus, everything below the wage rate and above the supply curve represents producer surplus, which in this case is workers because they're the ones producing the labor. And the consumer surplus, which I'm going to highlight in red, is everything below the demand curve and above the wage rate. Okay, and so depending on how large this deadweight loss area is, it's not clear that producer surplus actually increases significantly with this model. We can imagine a scenario where, although it does seem that consumer surplus does gain at the expense of, I'm sorry, producer surplus does gain at the expense of consumer surplus, meaning workers get a larger total surplus, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? And we end up with unemployment, right? So this classic trade-off between raising the wage and employment that a lot of people, I think, kind of intuitively understand. But the actual empirical evidence behind raising the minimum wage actually is at odds with that model that I just erased for some reason. I don't know why I erased it. But there's some empirical evidence that shows that there's a range at which you can actually raise the minimum wage from, let's say, $7 to $10 and actually not experience unemployment. And so the reason for this is, I mean, well, logically, I think some of you might jump to the idea that maybe it's not a binding minimum wage. Well, no, that's not the reason. The reason for this is firms have market power. That assumption about a perfectly competitive input market is a pretty heavy assumption. So to help us think and develop our intuition about imperfectly competitive input markets, I'm going to introduce this concept of monopsony. And before when we were discussing output markets, we learned about the range that existed between extremes. We learned about oligopolistic markets. We also learned about monopolistically competitive markets. But for input markets, we're only going to learn about the extremes, the perfectly competitive input market model, which allows us to come up with the individual firm supply curve, which we say is perfectly elastic, and then the imperfectly competitive extreme of a monopsony, where there's going to be only one employer, right? So they have sort of the ultimate market power, right? But we can think of other extremes like oligopsony, et cetera, that exists between this. Okay, so monopsony reflects a system in which there's one buyer, right? And so I've been talking implicitly about monopsonist activity and the ability for monopsonist activity to exert market power and effectively buy things for a price that is actually lower than the marginal revenue product, right? So I talked about how the government purchased and acts like a monopsonist with COVID-19 vaccines, and how they were able to purchase or exert power and purchase COVID-19 vaccines, presumably at a lower markup than if everybody just purchased COVID-19 vaccines by themselves, right? They were able to exert their market power. Okay. Hold on. Okay, so let's develop this model of monopsony. And what we'll notice is that it's going to be the inverse. I'm just making sure that I have communicated everything that I needed to communicate. Let me open my notebook. Let's develop this model of monopsony, and you'll notice that it's going to be the inverse of the monopoly market, right? Or the monopoly model, I should say. It's going to seem like the inverse of the monopoly model. And so what we'll have here is we're going to have a demand curve. And our demand curve in input markets is going to reflect the marginal benefit from adding an additional factor. And so the way that we think about this is we care about the marginal revenue product of, in this case, let's just say labor, right? So this assumption that we're going to make about this monopsonist is going to be there's only going to be one factor, and that factor is going to be labor, right? And of course, the other big assumption is that there's going to be one employer in whatever market this is. So our demand curve is going to be the marginal revenue product of labor, which is the marginal revenue times the price, or the marginal revenue, sorry, is the price in a perfectly competitive output market, sorry, but it's going to be the marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor, right? Because we don't care about just how much the additional unit can produce, we care about how much money we're going to get from that, like how much revenue we get from that, right? It's that example of the marginal product of labor curve, or marginal product of labor for a computer chip and a potato chip can be the same, right? The marginal product of labor, they could produce, like an additional labor on a demand curve could produce maybe a third potato chip and a third computer chip, but as a firm, we care more about the revenue, right? The actual price associated with that good, right? That's going to be our demand curve. That's going to be the marginal benefit that a monopsonist or that any firm entering the input markets has. And then our supply curve, before in the perfectly competitive model, our supply curve was perfectly elastic. It was horizontal, and we derived it from the wage. But now we're going to have an upward sloping supply curve. So we have an upward sloping supply curve there. And so before, in the monopoly model, we had a down, or remember we were faced with perfectly elastic demand in the output market for an individual firm, and then we had a downward sloping demand curve, much the same logic, right? We were faced with perfectly elastic supply in a perfectly competitive model. Now we have a upward sloping supply curve. And so what this is going to reflect too, assuming the supply curve is upward sloping, is that as the wage increases, you get more and more workers that are willing to work, right? And then so the x-axis is going to be L, and it's going to reflect the workers per day or whatever. And the y-axis is going to represent the wage in dollars per day. But this is going to create a disjuncture. There's going to be a disjuncture between the supply curve and the actual marginal factor curve, or marginal factor cost curve. And we can do some math. I'll do a mathy video that shows that this supply, or this marginal factor cost curve is going to be twice the slope of this supply curve, in the similar way in which in the monopoly model, the marginal revenue curve was downward sloping at twice the rate of the demand curve, but that I'll reserve for another video, right? As if it's a straight line. If it's a straight line, this is what we end up with, right? And the logic behind this is that if you wanted to hire additional workers in this market, then you have to charge a higher wage, right? And you can't just charge the next unit a different wage. We could talk about price discrimination or wage discrimination maybe later, but you can't just charge the next unit a different wage. In a similar way, there's a poisoning effect with the monopoly model. To achieve more output and achieve more labor, you have to charge a higher wage for everybody else. So there's a bit of a poisoning effect in this model. And so our marginal factor cost curve is going to be, for this individual firm, twice the slope of the supply curve, which we see here. And then the same logic holds, right? At the intersection of the marginal factor cost curve and the demand curve, that is going to represent the actual quantity. And let me look, what is the notation that I have? I'll just put, for now, 20 laborers. And then this intersection of the supply and demand curve would be, if it was a competitive market, that would be the amount of labor that's demanded in the competitive market. And then if we go across, this price would be the competitive price, but that's not the price that we actually see, or the competitive wage. This right here is going to represent the marginal factor cost of per unit of worker, right? The marginal factor cost per unit of worker. It's a changing marginal factor cost. Because MFC is really a rate of change. It's the change in cost over the change in output. This is going to reflect the marginal factor cost per unit of worker. And we're not going to set the wage here. We're going to see the wage is going to be set here, right? Because we're going to go to the supply curves, and we're going to see that the wage is going to be there. And so we can see that there's this gap, right? And let's say this is a wage of 20. There's this gap between what the worker is valued at, which is $40 to the firm, and the actual payment that the worker receives. Right? There's a gap. And so this is cool because it's kind of counterintuitive, but there's, or this part's not counterintuitive, but in a perfectly competitive market, the firm earns no surplus on the worker, meaning that the wage is for a worker is equal to their marginal revenue product for that worker. But in an imperfectly competitive market, the firm earns quite a bit of surplus on the worker. Right? There's a significant amount of surplus on the worker. The marginal revenue product associated with this example is much greater than the wage itself. Okay, and we can see that here, right? Right, the marginal revenue product is greater than the wage, right? And this reflects the market power the firm has. So this is a monopsonist market, and we can see that employment is down from the perfectly competitive outcome, and actually the wage is obviously lower than the wage at the perfectly competitive outcome, where PC is. And then the way that we can think about policy solutions, and this we can kind of complicate our analysis of the minimum wage from earlier in the year, is that if we set a minimum wage at the competitive equilibrium, effectively what we would be doing is that we would be creating a situation where the new supply curve for this firm is going to be perfectly horizontal, right? It's going to be perfectly elastic for that minimum wage, right? So assuming we're setting a minimum wage, I'm going to say MW right here, and then the supply curve is only going to become upward sloping, right? Because it's only going to become upward sloping after that point, right? So this would effectively, this green area is going to reflect the new supply curve if we set a minimum wage at the competitive equilibrium. And then if we can think about our marginal factor costs as being constant now, right? The change in cost over the change in output now has no slope. It's constant. And then it's only going to jump at this point. We go all the way up to the marginal factor cost curve, and then it's going to jump beyond that point. Right? So this yellow area would represent the new marginal factor costs. And what this minimum wage would do, and this is kind of the counterintuitive aspect of this model, is that it would actually create a situation in which we increase employment and we actually increase the wage, right? Which kind of, is a theoretical model that is more in keeping with the empirical studies of raising the minimum wage that have been conducted. Now, there have been empirical studies that have shown that there's a range in which it's sort of safe, and it depends, right? It depends on what the market is, but there's a range in which there's a sort of a safe area to raise minimum wage and expect that you don't encounter the trade-off of increasing employment, reflecting this idea that input markets are not perfectly competitive, that monopsonists are not wage takers as the perfectly competitive market structure mandated, but they are wage makers. And of course, the firms that exist in that somewhere between this extreme market and the perfectly competitive market are a bit of wage makers in some sense too. To kind of flesh out this thinking before I conclude, I wanted to also say that firms obviously have market power, and I'm not sure if I communicated this, but firms obviously have market power because it's unrealistic to make this assumption that labor markets are perfectly competitive in the sense that workers are able to costlessly transition between firms that pay a higher wage. Because clearly, it does take some costs. There may be moving costs, there may be social bonds established in specific zones in the country, right? There may be people that live in middle America that probably have the potential to earn a higher wage but don't want to because they have family ties. IDEA has market power over me. I've developed friends at IDEA San Benito, and so that probably went into my thinking in staying at IDEA San Benito another year instead of transferring to a school in McAllen, right? So firms exert market power, and sometimes it requires a little bit of sociology to think about that, but it's also just important. Okay, that was your video, and Angel, if you have any questions, let me know. Did you get it, Angel? It's kind of hard, but hopefully you'll be able to play it back.